In this episode, we take a look at the, quote, culture of fear that many scientists are saying has developed around gender medicine research, and specifically research onto medication and treatment for transgender individuals, and discuss how that seems or may be affecting the research and society in general. And in part two of our discussion, we'll react to the rap beef involving Drake and Kendrick Lamar and other heavyweights that recently exploded, and consider why it seems there don't seem to be many high profile rap beefs in modern times relative to maybe 20, 30 years ago. Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and riding shotgun with me is a man who may not be a chef, but he definitely can tell you what's beef. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, you ready to make sure that people get their fill today?
Yeah, that was a good one. I'm anticipating a reference to Raekwon, but what's beef was good.
Oh, there you go. There you go. All right. Now, before we get started, I ask that if you enjoy the show, please hit subscribe and like the show on YouTube or your podcast app. That really helps us as far as getting the show out. Now, we're recording this on April 16th, 2024. And Tunde, last week, we saw an interesting article in The Guardian which discussed how many researchers and scientists are either getting out of or just actively avoiding the field of gender medicine research because they're concerned that any discussion, once they have results and any discussion on those results will produce such a strong backlash amongst interested parties, whether it be people that are pro-transgender rights or people that are trying to take away transgender rights or whatever. And that kind of backlash is can be damaging to their reputation and subject them to abuse, whether online or otherwise. Essentially, there appears to be a concern that there are people that are so invested in a particular outcome that they're not they are resistant to scientific inquiry to the extent that scientific inquiry doesn't affirm what they already know, aka confirmation bias, or what they already believe they know. And this may be something that's now affecting people's decisions in terms of what to research and what fields to go into. So, Tunde, what stood out to you in this article discussing this idea of the, quote, culture of fear, in gender medicine research?
It's a very interesting topic because what stood out to me was it's very similar what's going on in this specific area of scientific discussion and research, or lack thereof, that we might be discussing today, due to these pressures from those outside the scientific community. It mirrors certain other parts of our society, which I'll discuss during the show what my observation is there. But specifically to answer, I think it makes sense that in something where we have new technology in terms of the medical technology to be able to allow people to, engage
hormone blockers and like that. Yeah, things that didn't exist 200 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point. Engage in being a transgender person in a much different way than ever was possible historically, right? So I think because of that newness, just like we've seen in other parts of our society, it's natural that we don't have a lot of scientific research and facts-based evidence type of studies about how this stuff affects humans, as well as why all of a sudden is there a larger amount of people that feel this way. So there's two different ways, multiple reasons why this stuff should be studied by people that are already in the scientific field dealing with biological stuff within humans. And I think
real quick, why are there more people here and how best to help them? I think that's really, when I was looking at the article, that was one of the things is how best do we help people that are experiencing this? So,
that's an interesting point, because that's where there's pushback in general from those outside the scientific community. And it's weird. It's you've got the pro-trans crowd that pushes back against the scientific community that tries to maybe bring in other ideas and conversations to why people are choosing to go down this road, and more so, let's say, than in prior generations. And then there's the pushback from the anti-trans side, which is kind of saying that any scientific sunlight on this is an affirmation that this is okay. So we got to be against that. So there really isn't room. And that's where I think it's interesting to me to see the fear part come in, because and some of this stuff that we read where the scientists are surprised themselves. They're like, this doesn't really happen in other areas of clinical research. So there's something greater. And we all know this. I mean, everyone watching this, I'm sure, is understands that transgender topic, or as a topic, is much more polarizing in our political discourse than many other topics today. So I think that has a part to do with as well, in terms of why people have latched on emotionally on either side of the debate and aren't willing to kind of look at some other way to discuss it, positive or negative.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing about that, I think that's distinguishing here is that the newness of a lot of this stuff. Like you said, there aren't long-term studies examining the different interventions. For example, if you're talking pharmaceutical interventions or things like that, hormone blockers, or all these various things, there aren't long-term studies on that. And so it's one thing to be polarized about high taxes or low taxes, or things that we've seen a lot of different kind of outcomes from that. It's not really medicinal in that sense as well. You're not changing the body in any way. But what I see with this is just this issue actually is, we human beings tend to, and this would suggest to me that we just want to view, or a lot of times people want to view things in a polarized lens. But this is one of those things that seems like it's just not really suited for a polarized lens, because the people that have already decided that these pharmaceutical interventions are the best way to do it, and they don't, any research that questions whether, okay, hey, is that the best way to do it? They're like, oh, this is anti-trans, by questioning from a scientific inquiry standpoint, whether this is the right way or the best way to do it, or if there's long-term effects that we should be aware of or concerned about or whatever. Because that then, now, from my standpoint, that's very important, because as an attorney, I'm very interested in informed consent. If you're going to do anything, consent on what you're agreeing to, both now and in the future, is very important. And so, to me, I look at that like, well, no, you need to know that, because that's the stuff that you need to know what you're agreeing to. But then on the other side, there seems to be a fear that there's going to be scientific, or they're going to uncover from a scientific standpoint, maybe that this stuff is not some abomination that they want to believe it is, or that there's some kind of, again, adding legitimacy to it, like you pointed out. And so the particular sides, and we always have to be careful assuming that everybody is on a edge here. Usually with issues like this, most people are somewhere in the middle, and then but the loudest people are further on the edges. And the fact that it's almost like trying to pull the scientists, like the from the edges, they're trying to pull the scientists into one of their camps and say, okay, well, if you're going to be in my camp, then we can only say this, and if you're going to be in my camp, we can only say that. And that's like the exact way you cannot do science. Like the reason why we live in a society now that's advanced as much as it has in the past 500-600 years is because we've tried to, and in many cases successfully, been able to keep science out of these type of arguments and disputes, because this type of, again, this is a natural human thing. But if, for example, the church is able to shut down the idea of, hey, the sun is the center of the earth revolves around the sun, not the sun revolving around the earth. If the church is successfully able to shut that down 600 years ago, then that doesn't allow science to continue to progress after that. And then, who knows where we end up. So the ability for science to continue to ask questions and to constantly question itself is very important to what we consider progress in many ways. So to me, this is why this stands out. Like, oh, whoa. It's actually trying to prevent the ability for scientific inquiry to do its thing.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting, because as you're talking, it reminds me of the period we were in 4 years ago with COVID, where it was something similar, where we had something new that was scary, and intimidating to most of us in society, a pathogen that's a pandemic and all that. And,
and also science, not long-term studies on the safety of.
Well, that's what I was getting at is science had to play catch up in learning, how to build a plane while they were flying, in terms of how this pathogen affected humans and how it spread and all that. And so you saw this divide, right? People that said, okay, we should listen to people like the scientists and Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx. The other people that said, no, we should listen to the politicians who are telling us that, everything sucks and we shouldn't be locked down and the herd immunity should. And the point is, I'm not here to make an opinion on either side, but it's a good example of how the scientific method of facts-based evidence and the time needed to do that was just not there, and the public
it moves
was
slow. You made this point
Yeah.
during the time, like that it moves slow, whereas people want immediate answers. And so,
and
politicians
so
don't move slow.
well, but here's the interesting comparison to this, and I'm sure many other things we can find in our society and in history, is without the ability for science to have time to do its fact-based kind of studies and all that. Like you said, people want answers. That's the natural human part. So what gets filled in that void normally is negative, ideological based stuff, right? And that's where the idea of things like conspiracy theories and all that pop up. So
People's
it's no
own
surprise,
biases and stuff like that.
and so it's no surprise that when you have a topic like transgender, which is very personal and has to do with something like male and female and gender and things that people have most people have feel is generally settled in the human discussion. If you don't have very fact-based evidence to support any of it or deny any of it, it's just that it's going to get filled as void. And then both sides of that, like you said, it's kind of that horseshoe theory thing. Both sides of that spectrum on the extreme begin to behave very similar, where it's ideology that begins to dominate any form of evidence. And I'll want to throw this back to you, because as you were talking too, I wrote down the word secularism. And I thought, it's an interesting example. I mean, again, why the United States is such an experiment historically, because what science really is a secular way to look at things. It's trying to bring in evidence and not use emotion or ideology. Whereas as humans, we are really built on our irrational beliefs and ideologies. And, as you're talking, as it reminds me of things like Pope Francis and the Catholic Church getting a lot of pushback because of his progressive stance on LGBT topics. And I know that LGBT gay people are not transgender. So I want to make sure that is recognized. But it's another example of, in a religious context, a lot of it is opinions and how you feel about it. Some people are very offended in the Catholic Church about how Pope Francis is behaving. Other people welcome it. But with science, it's not supposed to be like that. And that's where I think this is still that big battle in the human experience between secularism and belief. And it's crashing up here.
It's a good point to make, because secularism is hard. Like our natural way, so to speak, if you judge based on thousands and thousands of years of the human experience, our natural way isn't to do the secularism kind of thing. Like our natural way seems to be driven by the passions. And that makes sense to me, because for most of human existence, and even to this day, for some things, humans didn't understand why things happen. Why did it rain? That there wasn't some scientist that was going to give you that answer. It was going to be some shaman, and whether he was right or not, he gave you an answer that satisfied you, so it makes sense why people would, those kind of answers, like the shaman answer is going to be more fulfilling a lot of times than the scientific answer. Another big reason for this, and COVID illustrates this as well, because the scientific inquiry is that constantly questioning yourself, somebody put a theory out there, somebody else trying to knock it down. That takes time. So the answers don't I think COVID was a good example that we lived through, where after the fact, when it was, look back and science was like, okay, yeah, we got this part right, we got this part wrong, yada, yada, yada. And people were mad, like, oh, you got this part wrong. And it's like, well, but that's the part of their process, is they're going to try something and they're going to see what happens, and then they're going to evaluate it ideally. Now, again, that's when you have the scientific method and scientific inquiry done correctly. Now, we'll talk in a little bit about how that doesn't happen all the time, and we can't always take that for granted. But, I look at this in the sense that when we have issues that are of high passion, this is going to happen. This is just going to, there's no way to say that this is not going to happen. That scientists are out there talking now like there's a culture of fear and so forth is an alarm, essentially, where ideally as a society, if we can try to pull that back, that tension and that pressure back, it would be helpful. This is where, using one of your terms, leadership is important, to try to give science a chance. What we don't want to have happen in a situation like this is where the scientific process shuts down. We want them to continue operating ideally. And right now, the concern or the complaint is that it's an untenable situation. Like in the article, one of the scientists is talking about, oh, well, she gets hate mail when she reviews and looks at a study talking about trans women given hormones in order to breastfeed. And then so one group of people attacks her at that point. And then another group of people attacks her when she raises questions about the research, and she's looking at research as far as athletic performance in trans women, relative to regular women. And so, it's like, oh, hold on. Like, so there essentially any step she makes, any step she takes she's being accused by different people of conflicting things. And it's like, well, there's nowhere to go essentially in that kind of situation.
And that's where I feel like, there's a lot of people with a lot of other agendas on both sides of this. People that want to take other people's rights away and using this as another way to convince their fellow Americans that, hey, people like this shouldn't have equal rights and all this, and that could lead to slippery slopes with other groups. And then there's people that support trans people and, genuinely think and believe that they should have rights and not be discriminated against, which I agree with, not discriminating against anyone. But then, like you're saying, the idea of a scientist saying, hey, let's study actually what blocking a 13 or 14-year-old's hormones is going to do to that human being long term and any real physiological, emotional change it might make. They also beat up that scientist and say that they're anti-trans and that they're a bigot when they're asking genuine questions from a scientific background. So I feel like it's, again, this ideological extremism gets played out and has an outsized influence on the rest of us. And it's just what I mean, like COVID, like the big lie, like other things that have been allowed to permeate since the plethora of social media and the internet and smartphones in people's hands.
Well, but I mean, I think that's more tied to the human experience. And the reason is really because issues that tend to create hard lines and force you on one side or another, people who try to accumulate power, tend to like to use those, like those are issues that can say, hey, you're either with me or against me or whatever like that. So this issue, it's unfortunate that it's become one of those kind of issues because it's not necessarily, again, like I started this out with, this isn't, in my view at least, this isn't an issue that really lends itself along polarized lines, unless the polarized lines is, okay, should we give people dignity or not? But that's not really the discussion, because I think that, again, most people, if that's the only question we're asking, then I think that you would have an overwhelming support on the side of, yes, giving people dignity. But the issues become a lot more clouded than that, and fear is used and all that. But I didn't want to go down that path as much as it's a related path, though, that I wanted to ask you and to get into is that it does seem like with this, what we're seeing here is that a lot of times people are looking past necessarily what the scientist or the researcher is saying. And, like, okay, here, what is they're looking past what does the research say? Like, oh, okay, what is the hormone? If you give someone a hormone blocker when they're 13, what does that what does that do to that person physiologically over the next 10 years or whatever? They're looking past that. And they're more concerned with, okay, well, once a study like that is published, what will someone else do with that? Will someone else use that to then try to take something away or anything like that? And so the question I have for you is that, do you think that kind of leap in putting that on the scientists and saying, hey, you can't discuss this because if you come up with an answer that is concerning for us, then people who are operating in bad faith maybe are going to take that and use that to try to take away people's rights and so forth. Do you think that kind of leap is fair in this situation?
I mean, I can see the concern because this is where, again, a show we did in the past comes to mind on a topic of eugenics. Whereas, I mean, let's replace the trans word with, let's say, Black people.
Yeah.
If science came out and said, we found official, now through scientific method and all that Black people from Africa are less intelligent than other races on the world stage. You and I would probably get offended by stuff like that, and I'm sure a lot of people would. And then would be another side of that argument that would say, see, that justifies everything we always believe. And, the
Nazis forget the offense that people would take or the joy people would take from that or whatever. Yeah. And think about the laws that people might do then because of that.
Correct.
Or something like
Exactly.
that.
And
Really
that's
is what the kind of where the rubber meets the road is they're saying, and just for the record, by the way, like the thing about eugenics, which was most notable when you look back about that, is that there was such an effort to try to prove that type of statement. There was such an effort made, and that was they were never able to accomplish that,
well, not
and then
only
genetics
that,
came, that once genetics advanced, they find out they can't even tell the difference between
but
races.
stay on there, because not only were laws, implemented. I mean, these are things that affected people. I mean, think about it. The 1924 we had immigration laws specifically based on eugenics in this country. And so it
and then
changed
people
the
were getting
dynamic.
sterilized, and this goes beyond race, by the way. People were getting sterilized, and there was a time when that was people of science thought that they were going down the right path, and it wasn't until science got better that they realized that from a genetic standpoint, we can't tell the difference between what we classify as races, and so where we are with science now is different than where we were then because science thought one thing. Now, that gets into the whole whether science is being done right, because you have these biases that a lot of time lead people to conclusions that don't necessarily stand up to rigorous scientific testing, but it takes a while to get there. And in the meantime, like you said, there was a lot of harm done with with eugenics, for example, in terms of different undesirable characteristics or individuals or groups.
Yeah.
Now, the question though of, again, this goes back to kind of like the word dignity, like, I think that the sensitivity and the concern is real and legitimate, because there are people out there that want to take away, dignity and so forth from people, trans people. And so the concern of giving those folks, quote unquote, ammo is a fair concern. But again, from if you're talking about a societal management standpoint, that's where you go down that path. Trying to shut down the science, though, is, I think, that's the wrong approach to that. And so we see this like dealing with transgender issues and this quote unquote culture of fear, and we see it come up publicly, probably because of the nature of this, just how polarizing the issue has been in society. But do you think, just briefly, that how likely do you think this is happening in scientific communities all the time? This kind of let's shut this down or let's shut that down, or either ideology or whatever dictating what we hear or what doesn't come out. How often do you think this happens and we just never hear about it? Because I imagine this can't be the only time this ever happened in a scientific context.
You set me up with a loaded question. How many times do I think that it happens?
How likely do you think this is happening on a regular basis?
Because if we never hear about it, then it could happen all the time.
Exactly. It's a black box.
Yeah. No, I get the feeling that this is a little bit of an outlier, more than normal. And I say that, I'm not saying that there aren't other topics that the scientific community today is wrestling with that aren't controversial and all that. I just think that the majority of scientific research doesn't deal with this kind of public scrutiny while it's ongoing. Let's put it that way. We've done. I think
the key word there is public, though. General public.
Like, I'll give you an example. We did a show a couple months ago about the change in geology with the amount of plastic in the earth, right? And that they've classified into new forms of geology that have plastistones,
plastic rocks, plastistone.
And so, but I get the feeling that first of all, that wasn't debated in public when they were starting to find this stuff and research it, right? And it's not an emotional thing. I mean, if a rock's got plastic in it, so be it, and it sucks.
Nobody's shooting death threats at them.
Yeah, but it's not. But people don't feel like that's going to threaten their children and their way of being and their culture and their religion, and that's where this topic
they probably should, huh?
Yeah, well, then we got to get into climate change and pollution. We're going to start a separate show in the middle of a new, we can't do that. So and we're good at doing that. So at least I am. I won't blame you, but I can go on a tangent like the best of them. So let's keep me focused here. But that's what I'm saying is that it's kind of fascinating to watch it in that way, because as we're talking, like, thinking of one of the articles, because I try to find stuff from people on both sides of this argument preparing for it. And so I'm going to quote a little bit from an article of someone who is very supportive of the transgender community, who's also an associate biology professor. And she says, "To be sure, science only takes us part of the way in understanding the true complexity of sex and gender. And then rather than more anti-science legislation, we need better public education so that voters, our politicians, can understand there's the difference between sex, gender, and sexuality." And that's kind of what I'm saying. Okay, the first thing you're saying as a biologist is science can only take us part of the way. So that means you're already saying that science can't answer everything that I'm saying to you. So I got to give you my opinion in here. Yeah. And that's what I'm saying. And that's someone that supports it. And that's no different than someone that detracts from it.
Also public policy. And because that's science can only take us part of the way. We also need education. We also need, and implicit in that is somebody's just trying to, or what the thought is that telling people that this isn't the end of the world, so to speak, like educate, here's what's going on and so forth.
But here's where I find that interesting, because some of the stuff I read from like the Pediatrics Association, like again, people that are actual like real medical doctors that study this stuff and researchers and geneticists, it's because we throw around the words so easily that reading this stuff is like, oh yeah, that's true. That's kind of what I thought. And when I say this, no matter what you do to yourself, you cannot change really your biological gender. And they made some
sex,
really strong cases.
Sex, right?
Yeah, like meaning that if I go through the full, as a man, the full thing, and let's say I get my penis cut off, someone puts in a vagina surgically, I get all the hormone blockers, I start taking estrogen and all that. At the end of the day, my genetics and my DNA is still male. It's XY chromosomes. So it's still trying to fight that battle against the changes that I'm artificially trying to put in my body. And again, that's somebody could watch me say that is on the extreme supporting side of trans and just say that I'm totally wrong and that I'm a bigot for saying that. I mean, I'm sorry if someone believes that, but that's why XY chromosomes are about. So,
and part of what that person was saying, though, was, just that you also are setting yourself up for a lifetime of pharmaceutical intervention, like that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now you're going to have to, you take pills for the rest of your life as well. So, and that stood out to me as well, just the kind of that you can't change your biological sex, and, you can, you do different things as far as your gender identity and changing your body and so forth, and your appearance and, how you feel and so forth. But, and a lot of that stuff with the hormones and stuff, we don't fully understand yet, which suggests that, we should continue the scientific process. Not to say that, to your point that you made, we'll ever get there. From my standpoint, I look at this and I think that the key word you said was publicly. I think this happens all the time, that scientists face pressure from different sources. I just don't think it's usually coming from the general public, social media or, whatever, people, calling you a bigot or whatever. I imagine that, like enter large corporation X, if you want to say that aspartame causes cancer, then you're going to get a lot of pressure from certain, whatever businesses or that make that product, that which is the artificial sweetener and like Diet Coke and all that. If you want to say and I say this because I have knowledge that this happens, and this happened with that chemical in particular in the 1970s, 1980s and so forth. And so, and then recently that the World Health Organization has taken another look at that. I think that, in a similar example, again, drawing on history, if you want to get out there and start talking greasy about Roundup, and how, that may cause cancer and, all this other stuff, I think you're going to get a lot of pressure from insert company X that is going to say, if you publish this, we're going to ruin your career, yada, yada, yada. So I think the difference, or the thing that kind of stands out here, isn't the pressure that the scientists are under. It's
what about Pfizer on the show?
All of them. All of them. Like,
that one was publicly debated. We don't know about the Roundup researchers and the aspartame.
We do,
and all that.
It just wasn't it wasn't something that generated a lot of news, but it's out there. You can read about all that kind of stuff. So I think the unique thing is just that it's this general public pressure, because it's an issue that the general public is just so passionate about. So I say that to say, now I don't know that the science always gets to the right answer in the face of pressure either. So, and I think that you can cite examples where science kind of does just look the other way, and to keep the peace and to lessen the pressure. So I'm not saying this is going to all work out, to our favor, but the idea that public pressure from the public at large caught my eye, because, like, again, it's just different from I don't think it's different from the pressure they normally face, but it's different source from the pressure they normally face. And, maybe that is the world that we've entered, where that might not have happened in 1980 because there was no way for the public to generally find out, whether it be information or misinformation about it, and then having an opportunity to express all that. But the public piece of this is what really makes it stand out to me.
Well, I think it's also just what it is, this arguments about gender makes it something very personal for people, very emotional. And then also it allows for the creep of other ideological parts of our life that are very important to many people, like religion, to come in. Like religion probably wouldn't be brought up if the spat between some research scientists and, Monsanto about some chemical they put in some soybean, right? That wouldn't like pick on people's emotional heartstring. But when you talk about LGBTQ stuff and transgender, and again, we are in a current culture right now. Like we talk about 50, 70 years ago, the culture was more racial, that it was, not good for the races to mix because of, all these things. And like you've stated, going back 400 or 500 years, it was Galileo getting put in jail because he challenged that dogma of the day that the earth was not the center of the universe and all this. So and again, he was able to be seen as going against the religion, the authority of the time. So I think that a lot of this also plays into just when it's these topics that allow other, people in the society that want to control others, just like the abortion debate and all that, the things that generally didn't come up in religion maybe 100 years ago are now all, brought into these spheres of influence so that people can do what we've seen in the last few years, which is get their ideology into the school curriculum, all that, what they project and blame others, that they're trying to indoctrinate and all that. And they use the fear that, some trans athlete is going to somehow upend all kids' sports. And even though I don't agree that a kid taking hormones that's a man or born a male should compete at 16 with women, I don't think that's enough to stop our society. I think we can still have those conversations and not try and take everyone's rights away. So to me, it's very nuanced, but, got to stay on the side of equality.
All right. Well, I think we can wrap from there. Thank you for joining us, part one of this discussion. And part two will be coming up shortly. So I hope you join us with that one as well.